The summer Elias Cobb turned 19. The parish draft board met in the back room of DeVault's hardware store on a Thursday morning and decided, in the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee, that he wasn't fit to die for his country. The man who told him this was named Gerald Pitts. He had soft hands, a county clerk's paunch, and the particular kind of authority that belongs to men who have never once had to earn it. He slid the rejection letter across the counter without looking up from his ledger. "Come back when you're needed," Pitts said. Elias stood at the counter for a moment. He was 6 feet tall, broad across the shoulders, with hands that had been hauling crawfish traps since he was 8 years old. He picked up the letter. He read it twice, though there wasn't much to read. He folded it carefully, tucked it into his shirt pocket, and walked back out into the Louisiana heat. His mother was waiting on the porch when he got home. She looked at his face and didn't ask. 3 weeks later, Danny Arsenault shipped out from the same parish. There was a parade, not a large one. This was Terrebonne Parish, not New Orleans, but a real parade nonetheless. The American Legion post turned out. The high school band played. Danny's mother wept into a handkerchief and his father shook every hand within reach. Danny himself stood in the back of a pickup truck in his new army uniform, waving like a man who had already won something. Elias watched from the sidewalk. He and Danny had grown up 2 streets apart, had fished the same ditches, had gotten into the same kind of trouble that boys in small towns get into when the summers are long and the adults aren't watching. They weren't close the way people sometimes said. Those two are thick as thieves, but they were something. They were the particular kind of friends that a place makes for you. Before you're old enough to choose for yourself, Danny spotted him in the crowd. He pointed. He grinned the wide, uncomplicated grin of a boy who has never been told he isn't needed. Elias raised his hand. The truck turned the corner and Danny was gone. The second rejection came in, October. Elias had reapplied through a different channel, driven 2 hours to the New Orleans office, sat in a wooden chair for 4 hours, and made his case to a man in a uniform who listened with the patient, glazed attention of someone waiting for a train. "Son," the man said finally, "the army has more men than it can use right now." This was a lie so transparent that the man didn't bother to sell it. He was already reaching for the next folder. Elias drove home in the dark. He didn't tell his mother. He sat on the back steps of the house and listened to the bayou make it slow. Indifferent sounds in the dark, the frogs, the water moving through the grass, the occasional splash of something large turning over in the deep channel. It was the sound he'd grown up with. It had always meant home. That night, it just meant stuck. The third time, he didn't apply. He showed up. He had heard through a cousin in New Orleans that the 92nd Infantry was taking volunteers out of the federal office on Decatur Street, that there was a sergeant there named Beaumont, who had a reputation for not asking too many questions if a man looked capable enough. Elias drove to New Orleans before sunrise. He was first in line when the office opened. Sergeant Beaumont was a compact, weathered man from Alabama who looked at Elias the way a carpenter looks at a piece of lumber, assessing, practical, entirely without sentiment. "You've done this before?" Beaumont asked, meaning had he been rejected before. "No, sir," Elias said. Beaumont looked at him for a long moment. Then he pushed a form across the desk. "Fill that out," he said. "Don't leave anything blank." 2 months later, Elias Cobb shipped out of New Orleans. There was no parade. The Pacific was nothing like Louisiana, and exactly like it at the same time. The heat was the same kind of heat. wet, total, a heat that lived inside your clothes and never left. The insects were different, but served the same purpose, which was to remind you that you were meat. The water was everywhere, in the air, in the ground, in your boots by the end of the first hour. Elias had spent his whole life in a landscape that was trying to dissolve back into water, and so in that particular way, he felt more prepared than most. What nobody was prepared for was the sound. The first time Elias heard a mortar round come in, he didn't understand what it was. It wasn't what the movies suggested. It wasn't a whistle. It was a tearing, a sound like the air itself was being ripped open along a seam. Then the ground lifted. Then the sound caught up with everything else in a single, enormous concussion that he felt more in his chest than his ears. Asterisk, he was in a ditch. He would spend a great deal of the next 2 years in ditches. The men of his unit were from everywhere: Alabama, Georgia, Illinois, New York. They had the same arguments men always have when they're bored and frightened and sleeping in the dirt, about women, about food, about who had it worse back home. Elias mostly listened. He had a reputation in the unit for being quiet, which in the army means you're either stupid or smarter than you're letting on. His sergeant, a man from Detroit named Corporal Reeves, had figured out early which one it was and used Elias accordingly. Cobb sees things, Reeves told a lieutenant once, before the rest of us see them. It was true. Elias couldn't entirely explain it. Growing up on the bayou, you learned to read stillness, learned that the absence of sound meant something was present, that the way birds lifted off a tree line meant something was moving below it. In the Pacific, that same reading kept him alive on 4 separate occasions that he could count, and probably more that he couldn't. The one that stayed with him wasn't the one where he saved himself. It was a morning in late 1944, in the hills above a village whose name he could never pronounce correctly. His unit was moving through a narrow ravine, the kind of terrain that made every man's neck tighten because there was nowhere to go but forward, and the sides were too steep to climb. Elias was near the back of the column. He noticed the birds first, a sudden total absence, and then the quality of the shadows on the left ridge, the way they were slightly too dark in one section, slightly too regular. He opened his mouth to say something. He didn't get the word out before the firing started. What happened in the next 4 minutes was the kind of thing that takes 4 minutes to live through and for decades to process. Men were down. The column was pinned. Reeves was screaming orders from somewhere Elias couldn't see. Elias moved forward, not because he had a plan, but because the men ahead of him were not moving and someone had to. He got to the front of the column. He got eyes on the position. He relayed it back. He pulled 2 men out of the open ground and into cover that he found because the bayou had taught him where cover hides, in the low places, in the shadow of things, in the spots that looked like nothing when it was over. Reeves found him sitting against a rock, reloading with hands that had stopped shaking 20 seconds after the firing stopped. It was the way Elias's hands worked. They held steady when they needed to and let go after. "You see that ridge before it started?" Reeves asked. "Almost," Elias said. Reeves sat down next to him. For a long time, neither of them said anything. There was a quality to the silence after a firefight that Elias had never found words for. Not peaceful, not relieved, just emptied out. "You got people back home?" Reeves asked. "My mother," Elias said. "And a dog." "What kind of dog?" "The useless kind," Elias said. "She just sits on the porch and watches things." Reeves laughed. It was a real laugh. tired and unguarded, and it surprised them both. "Good dog," Reeves said. He learned about Danny in a letter from his mother, written in her careful schoolteacher's hand. In the spring of 1945, Danny Arsenault had been killed in France, in a town his mother's letter spelled 3 different ways. He had died in November. The letter had taken 4 months to find Elias. He read it in a tent in the Philippines, in the particular grey light of early morning before the heat came up. He read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in the same shirt pocket where he'd once put the draft board's rejection letter, which had long since disintegrated, but the pocket remained. He sat with the news for a while. He thought about Danny on that truck, pointing and grinning. He thought about the particular unfairness of it, not the unfairness of the war, which was beyond calculation, but the small, specific unfairness that Danny had gotten the parade and Elias had gotten Gerald. Pitts's soft hands sliding a letter across a counter, and Danny was dead in France and Elias was alive in the Philippines, and neither of those facts had anything to do with parades or letters or what any of them deserved. He wrote Danny's mother a letter that took him 3 days to finish. He threw the first 6 versions away. The final one said very little. It said he had known Danny since they were boys. It said Danny had been a good man. It said she should be proud. All of it was true. None of it was enough. He sent it anyway. He came home in September of 1945. On a transport ship out of San Francisco that smelled of diesel and several hundred men who had been at sea too long. He took a bus from New Orleans to Homer and then hitched a ride on a cane truck the last 12 miles. His mother was on the porch. The dog was next to her. Both of them watched him walk up the road without getting up, which was exactly right. He sat on the porch steps. His mother put her hand on his shoulder once and then went inside to get him something to eat. The dog moved from her spot and lay down across his feet. The bayou made its sounds. The light came down through the Spanish moss in long, dusty columns. He sat there for a long time. The parish didn't do much with the men who came back. There was a modest ceremony at the courthouse, some handshaking, some American flags, a speech from a councilman that managed to be both patriotic and entirely impersonal. The men from the 92nd were present at this ceremony in the way that furniture is present in a room, acknowledged by no one, moved around, eventually set to one side. Gerald Pitts was at the ceremony. He was standing near the punch table, still soft-handed, still carrying his particular authority like a man who has never had to put it down. He saw Elias across the room. He gave a brief, decisive nod, the nod of a man who is acknowledging something he doesn't intend to discuss. Elias looked at him for a moment. He thought about the letter. He thought about the ravine. He thought about Reeves's laugh in the silence after the firefight, and about the letter he'd written Danny's mother, and about the dog asleep across his feet that morning on the porch. He nodded back, not because Gerald Pitts deserved it, but because Elias Cobb had learned, in the particular education that a war provides, that you don't spend what you have left on men who aren't worth it. He got a glass of punch and went to talk to the other men from his unit who were standing near the door, not quite inside and not quite outside, in the way that men who have been through something together will naturally find each other. In a room full of people who haven't. The months after were harder than the war in the particular way that stillness is harder than movement. In the war there had always been something to do, something to read, something to survive. At home there was the bayou, the heat, his mother's cooking, the dog. and a future that sat at the end of every day like an unanswered question. He worked. He fished the same channels he'd fished as a boy. He helped his uncle repair a shrimp boat. He did not talk about what he'd seen, not because he was keeping a secret, but because the people who asked, "What was it like over there?" were asking a question that had about 40 different answers, none of which fit inside the kind of conversation people have on a front porch on a Sunday afternoon. What he did, slowly, over the course of that first year, was notice things. It was what he'd always done. It was what had kept him alive. But now he turned it on the parish itself, on the town, on the way things worked, and for whom. He noticed which buildings had new paint and which didn't. He noticed which roads got graded and which didn't. He noticed where the good jobs were and who held them, and how that had not changed 1 degree since he'd left. He noticed the way the GI Bill moved through the parish like a river, taking the most direct path to the places it had already been heading, and leaving other places dry. He thought about Reeves. He thought about the men he'd served with who had come from Alabama and Georgia and never said anything that suggested they expected the country to be fair, only that they expected it to eventually be honest. He thought about Danny who had gotten the parade, Danny who had gotten France, Danny who was 22 years old in a town his mother couldn't spell, permanently one afternoon in the spring of 1946. Elias drove to New Orleans. He found a GI advocacy office on a narrow street in latrine, staffed by 2 men about his age, and a woman who moved through the small, paper-crowded office like she was in charge of it, which she was. Her name was Celestine. She had a precise, assessing intelligence and the kind of stillness that Elias recognized. The kind that isn't emptiness, but capacity. "What do you want?" she asked him, not unkindly. Elias looked around the office, at the stacks of files, at the names on folders, at the maps on the wall with pins in them. "I want to be useful," he said. Celestine looked at him the way Sergeant Beaumont had looked at him years before, assessing practical, "Can you read a legal document?" She asked, "Yes. Can you drive?" "Yes. Can you keep your mouth shut when it needs to be kept shut and open it when it needs to be opened?" Elias thought about the ravine. He thought about the almost seeing the ridge, almost getting the word out, the half-second gap between knowing and speaking. "I'm working on it," he said. Celestine almost smiled. She pulled a folder from the top of the nearest stack and set it in front of him. "Start there," she said. He drove back to Terrebonne that evening through the long, flat light of the Louisiana Delta. The road ran straight for miles, the sugarcane tall on both sides, the sky enormous and orange above it all. The same road he'd driven since he was old enough to get behind a wheel. The same ditches, the same heat rising off the blacktop. But a man who has spent 2 years reading landscapes for what they're concealing does not look at the same road the same way twice. He saw the parish for what it was, the part of it that was beautiful, and the part of it that was a system, and the part of it that was a test that had been running since before he was born. He had passed one part of that test in a ravine in the Philippines. He understood now that the other part, the longer part, the part with no sergeants and no clear enemy, and no moment where the firing suddenly stops and the silence empties everything out, was only just beginning. He drove home through the last of the light. His mother would be on the porch. The dog would be on the steps. Tomorrow he would go back to New Orleans. Tomorrow he would open the folder. The ditch, he had learned, is not always the place where things end. Sometimes it's just the place where you wait until you can see clearly enough to move. He kept driving,